Hello everybody, time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Rennie's Island. Hello there! I know you're all familiar with the story of how Peter Stuyvesant bought Manhattan Island from the Indians for some $20-odd worth of trinkets, and then parlayed his luck of real estate into the Hudson and East Rivers into the richest section of terra firma on the face of the earth. And there's nothing in Grays Harbor's rich history that comes close to that story for sheer wonder-making. But we do have an island story, and like the tale of Manhattan, it has a good hero. And like the hero of the story of New York, our own legend has preserved the hero's name right down to the present time. And if the legend hadn't preserved the name, the formal documents of the county files would have done so. For the hero of our story tonight could walk into town today, nearly 35 years of absence, and find his name familiar on every map in Grays Harbor and on the tongues of most of its citizens. So when Dick has had a few words from our sponsor, we'll tell you the story of Rennie's Island, or at least that portion that we have in our scrapbook, and also a word about the man who gave the island in Grays Harbor its name. But first, here's Dick, who in accordance with custom takes a few seconds for a word from our sponsor. It was in the late 1890s that Bill Rennie looked out the window of the old Northwestern Mill filing room and ruminated on a chunk of green that stuck out of the brown waters of Grays Harbor. He looked at it many times and switched his jawbreaker of tobacco to the other cheek and spat philosophically. At first, Bill had thought that that patch of green grass surrounded by acres of mud at low tide as only an impediment in the river's navigation. He had watched the river little boats jockey around the island into the canal. Sometimes he sat on the mill dock, straddled a 12-by-12, and contemplated the long rafts swinging into the mouth of the Hoquiam River, with the island for background. There was the salt grass and a little stand of willows, and in the fall of that year there were flocks of ducks and geese that came down there and made their island a hunter's paradise, just a 10-minute row from the back doors of many Grays Harbor residents. Now, in those days, as far as I can learn, the little island had no particular name. It was just Section 13, Range 10, Township 17 of Grays Harbor County, and it was the only chunk of dry land in that section. Its history was simple. Andrew J. Campbell, Hoquiam pioneer, had acquired it from the United States government on November 1st, 1865. It had been owned successfully by Michael L. Lark of Tacoma, Olympia, and Grays Harbor Railroad, William E. Campbell, and since by several receiverships, James Fuller and his wife, and the Union Oil Company, amongst others. But back in Bill Rennie's day, it was a chunk of tidewater dry land that no one seemed to want. How long Bill Rennie ruminated on the possibilities of that island, history doesn't record. But one day, just to see how it looked close up, he rowed a boat over to the spot of the green grass above the high tide mark and stepped foot on the island. And he liked it. Now, we know very little about Bill Rennie, but we must conclude that he had the tenacity of a recluse back in those days. Later, Bill settled down on 5th Street in Hoquiam and became one of the townsfolk. But in the early years, he must have felt the strong urge to enjoy the best of all good company, only his own. Anyhow, Bill Rennie decided to move out to that island in Section 13. He went about the business of getting together the essentials of his Robinson Crusoe life, and little by little on Sundays, and when the mill was shut down, he moved his stock of requirements to the island. he built a rude one-room house, not crude enough to call it a shack, but hardly dignified by the little title to be called a house. And Bill Rennie squatted on the island that he was going to try to call home. He raised a dike against the incoming tide, not high, limited in scope, but a wall to secure his private domain against the floodwaters that he knew would be coming along. And when the real high tides came in, backed up by the rush of river waters down from the hill, his little island contracted to the area of his little dike ground. He planted a garden and tended it between hours at the mill, and he thought some of bringing out a cow to graze on the lush grasses on the tidelands, for the island was about one cow size when the waters were down to normal. From the mainland, the people of Grays Harbor watched the house go up. They saw the dike form, and Bill's activities were the business of the entire harbor as people wondered just why anyone would select that spot of ground for his own, when the hills and the fields for miles around are available just for the asking. But Bill had his reasons, no doubt, and after a summer's work, it was a snug little harbor for a bachelor. Moreover, the owner of the property didn't seem to care, and Bill got no eviction notice. His house on the highest spot on the island, which means only that it stood above all the highest tides, had a clear view up the Hoquiam River, and from his side yard he could scan the harbor for sailing ships coming in. Now, it is possible that Bill Rennie would have fashioned himself quite a homestead on that island at the mouth of the Hoquiam River if autumn hadn't come so soon. But it did, and it brought the rains and the high waters. The winds whipped up the canal, and the water was rough. Crossing to his new job at the Panel and Folding Box Company, Bill was more than once in distress. It gave his homestead a somewhat foreboding appearance and dampened his ardor for the lonely life as a Grays Harbor Islander. But the final straw came with the high water. Up came the tide one morning, and the waters from the river were high with rains. Then there was the old southwest wind that adds to the tidal levels, and lo, Bill Rennie saw the water creeping up past his dike without regard for the old high water marks. At the top it flowed over and swept around the underpinnings of his cabin and almost up to the floor of his little structure. When the waters of the river had gone down, Bill dug a hole in his dike to drain the area, which had become a lake. And when the digging was good, he added a few more inches of earth to his dike, just above the inches that he figured the water had risen above the barrier. But another one came, as a guest probably that November, and it too went over the dike and washed away the top he had added. And that month Bill began to move back to Hoquiam. Well, Bill Rennie eventually became a foreman at the Hoquiam Lumber and Shingle Company and was a confirmed believer in living amongst his fellow men. That was along about 1911, when he lost track of him. But if he were to return today, he would hardly be expected to recognize the little island off Hoquiam's channel that was his home for a short time. Change, that inevitable force, for the better or worse, has had its way with a few hundred square yards of green sward that Bill Rennie tried to homestead by squatter's rights. For more than 10 years after he moved away from the island, his little house stood there as a landmark for mariners and for people searching for the island at real high tides. Over the years, it has been a rendezvous for hunters who didn't want to go too far from home, and a reference point for flyers and navigators. But it is not the absence of his house that would throw Bill. It's the change in the dimensions of the island. For, with the port of Grays Harbor taking over the maintenance of the river canals, more than 8 million yards of river slit have been poured on the island in the last 25 years. It is now a full-grown island, growing in height and width as well. It's a full 1.5 miles long and varies from a mile to a half a mile in width. Over most of it is level plain of waving green grass. On dry summer days, it has dust storms as realistic as Oklahoma, and sun-baked river slits is whipped in rolling clouds from one end to the other. Moreover, the island has a useful industrial function today that gives it purpose in Grays Harbor's scheme of things. It provides the location for the treating plant of the Grays Harbor Rayonier pulp mill that disposes of its waste liquor there. And if people keep on pumping river silt and waste liquor onto the island, it may continue to grow until it outstrips Bill's wildest dreams of the island and actually becomes an area of value to the harbor for industrial sites. In any event, like most things on the harbor, it's grown a lot since its grove of willows and the waving strip of green intrigued Bill Rennie into making it a home, to become the king of an island in Grays Harbor, and to leave the island his name. For on all the maps of our port, there is this, big as anything, though there is some question as to whether they spelled Bill's name correctly. Old documents spelled it with one N. And now, after Dick Crombie has a word from our sponsor, we'll be back with a few footnotes from our hometown scrapbook. Speaking of high water swirling about the lowlands, as we were mentioning at the flood that overtook Bill Rennie's island habitation, we are reminded of what is one of the highest tides recorded in the harbors over the years. We wouldn't go so far to call it the highest without checking through the good books of records for our area. But it was a dandy as high waters went. It was on December 1st, 1909, and the tide, aided by the freshest from the rivers and the strong southwest wind that held back the normal runoff, the tide pushed the gauge up to 16 feet. It did its share of damage, you may be sure. It carried away a good-sized river scow that belonged to P.J. Morant, washed off 15 miles of the Northern Pacific Railroad track along the Chehalis, taking a piece here and a section there, and closed about 10 miles of with slides that accompanied the storm and high water. The wireless operator at Westport was driven out of his station by the water, and it flowed in and over the lowlands of Aberdeen and Hoquiam. The most accurate mark of that high water was the one that was made in the I.L. Scammon home on the south bank of the Chehalis River near Montesano. A high water mark had been kept there since settlers began to call the Chehalis Valley home back in the 1850s. And water rose 27.5 inches above the highest previous mark, according to Captain Briscoe, a riverboat operator who was right interested in just what happened to the river canal and how he wondered if he was going to be able to operate over a large area as he did before. It wasn't this high tide that moved Billy Rennie off his island. He was gone from the little patch of ground in the harbor long before 1909's high water. But if he had chosen to stick out the minor floods that swept over the island at winter, this one would have licked him. For among other things, it is recalled that some as the flood that pulled the foundation out from under the house, and it started on a final career so much and created driftwood from homes. And as such, we recorded here tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.